Okay, so our theme this week is political zoology, and I'm taking that to be fairly obviously the meeting point of politics and animals. Politics has often been described, and I'm not suggesting this is the only model, but it's often been described on one model at least, as the meeting point of the concerns of the rights or demands of the individual and the rights and demands or necessity of the collective. And in addressing this question of political zoology this afternoon, what I want to do is capture something of this sort of mediation, this tension between the individual and the collective, with my slightly paradoxical title, The Family of One. This theme of the family of one will recur through the talk as I address as a necessary component of the question of politics. Are you not hearing me?
So I just make the microphone like this, and now...
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Shall I go back? It's long enough as it is. I'm looking at the question of family one as a means of addressing this sort of negotiation, which is a common theme within political theory between the individual and the collective, but in a slightly unusual way, and I'll elaborate this as I go through. So the key point is this notion of the family of one will recur through the talk as a way of addressing the question of identity, which I see as crucial and vital to the notion of politics and political theory. So my key themes today are identity, the individual and the collective, and the family of one. So just to run you through the three sections of the talk, here's what I'd like to do. In the first section, headed The Root of Our Discontent, I want to outline a particular form of self-identification that you find in many different writers. And this form of self-identification invokes one kind of family of one, and it causes me some discontent, hence the subtitle. So this section ranges over quite diverse writers. It's wide-ranging. And I'm going to look a little at Barthes, at Sartre, at Althusser, and then provide some illustrative examples from visual culture to explain this question I've got a problem with. In the next section, Wie man wird, was man ist, I turn to Nietzsche's notion of becoming what one is, becoming what you are. And this notion invokes a different kind of family of one that I want to contrast with the first and to appropriate and to expand on a little. And this section is much more focused, and we'll concentrate solely on Nietzsche and particularly on his autobiographical Ecce Homo. And then the final section, under the heading Lineages, Colours and Cunnilingus, I want tentatively to outline three alternative forms of self-identification, or three other kinds of family. And this includes the talk's racier material, as you may have gathered, and I warn you there are illustrations in this section as well. So I'll talk for about 55 minutes or so, and then leave the remaining time for questions or for discussion. So I'd like to open with Sartre's notion of bad faith, which may or may not be familiar to you. I'm going to provide an overview of that. So Sartre suggests in Being and Nothingness that one of the ways in which human beings cope with the burden of freedom is by means of the practice or project of bad faith. Faced with the unbearable prospect of absolute existential freedom, human beings adopt an identity that they intend to fully define and delineate them. They seek to escape this uncomfortable situation by denying their freedom and seeking to act and behave only as this role or identity dictates. Sartre's famous example is the cafe waiter you may have come across. The waiter throws himself into his role. He's overly attentive to customers. His behaviour is almost mechanically perfect and so on. So he strives to be the very essence of the archetypal waiter. In fact, he identifies so fully with the role of waiter that he's like an automaton, a thing with no freedom at all. He denies to himself all the other possible ways of acting and behaving, of identifying and being. Nonetheless, Sartre says, the waiter knows deep down that this identification is a willful over-identification. The role of waiter does not define and delineate him. He does not have to act this way, and he is, of course, far more than just a waiter. And it's this duplicitous, self-deceptive nature of the identification here which makes this bad faith. The individual knows but refuses to acknowledge to himself that he's more than just a waiter. And the elements of Sartre's notion of bad faith, which I'd like to take up, is this idea of living without acknowledging to yourself that the identity to which you're holding fast is just one of a potentially infinite number. Appropriating Sartre's understanding, the root of my discontent is a particular form of bad faith. And specifically, it's the persistent self-identification in a whole range of writers, academic and otherwise, and I'm going to look at a few as we go through, and by means of a particular rhetorical strategy, which I'll elaborate. It's this persistent self-identification as preeminently, or perhaps even exclusively, human. So that's the key focus that I'm going to try and unpack in this first part. And I'm going to provide two examples by way of illustration of the kind of thing I'm talking about here. One of which is explicitly academic and openly opposed to the sympathetic, political or ethical treatment of other animals. And the other, which is by no means academic, but much more open to an animal sensibility. But they're both examples of this form of self-identification in which I'm interested. So my first example comes from an essay by the legal scholar Richard Epstein, titled Animals as Objects or Subjects of Rights. The essay as a whole is a critique of the whole idea of extending rights to animals, largely on the basis that human civilization, he says, has consistently, despite its varied forms, depended on what he calls the domestication of animals. And now, I don't want to go into the details of the argument. It's not the specific argument that he's making that I'm interested in. It's just the closing sentences of the essay as an illustration of this particular form of self-identification that I want to pick up on. So Epstein says, "The root of our discontent is that in the end we have to separate ourselves from the rest of nature from which we evolved. Unhappily but insistently, the collective we is prepared to do just that. Such is our lot, and perhaps our desire as human beings." So you'll notice there's absolutely no question in Epstein's mind that it's as a human being that he's identifying here. And particularly you'll notice that there's a lot of first-person plural pronouns in there. We, our, ourselves. And this is that rhetorical strategy that I mentioned, in which I'm particularly interested. Epstein self-identifies as human, and he consistently marks this self-identification by means of the personal pronoun we. Okay, so that's my first example. My second example comes from a very different source, which has very different sympathies. This is a children's book called Making Friends Just Like Us by Jess Stockham, which is far more going for it. It's a wonderful text. It's far more going for it than the exciting fold-out flaps that you can see advertised on the cover. The book explicitly emphasises particular commonalities between human and non-human animals. So to give you just a few examples of these, we're told that budgerigars chatter cheerfully, and then you fold out the flap, just like us. Zebras nestle and nuzzle, just like us. Chimpanzees hold hands happily, just like us. Okay, and there's a whole series of these through the text, through the book. Despite my best efforts, I've attempted to get my daughter to be interested in this book, but she'll have none of it. She likes the octonauts and all the usual stuff. So setting aside even my passion for alliteration, there's certainly an attraction here in drawing attention to these commonalities between animals and humans, which is something I enjoy in the book. But I'd suggest there's a problem with the way in which Stockham does this. Even whilst emphasising the commonalities, she's still self-identifying as human by using those first-person plural pronouns. The zebras nestle and nuzzle like us humans, chimpanzees hold hands happily like us humans, and so on. So both authors, Epstein and Stockham, take we humans as their starting point, and their mode of expression is the same, despite the very different audiences and agendas that they have. Now, this kind of self-identification as human is most often done unreflectively and on no explicit basis. It's so obvious, so normal, that it seems unnecessary to need even to spell it out. We might call it, for this reason, a kind of anthroponormative self-identification. And what I'd actually like to do is to spend a little bit of time spelling it out, to make explicit what this common human we is that the writers so often invoke and depend upon and draw from without discussing or engaging with it explicitly. The term human, as it's used in these contexts, means, I think, far more than just the natural biological species Homo sapiens, of course. Ideologically and historically, human is a far more loaded term than this relatively recent natural category, although, of course, this natural category, with all its authoritative scientific connotations, undoubtedly lends the weight of that authority today when we hear the term human. I think that what writers very often have vaguely in mind is some kind of great ahistorical, transcultural human we. And this kind of ahistorical, transcultural human we is perfectly encapsulated in a particular photographic exhibition, which I'd like to use as an illustration of this conception of humanity, which I'm going to sketch out now. So the Family of Man exhibition was curated by Edward Steichen. I don't know if people have come across Steichen's exhibition before. Maybe some. I hadn't until relatively recently. It was called The Family of Man. It was first shown in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It comprised 503 photos taken in 68 different countries, and it ultimately toured all around the world. And the photographs were reproduced in a massively popular and best-selling book by the same title. And Steichen says in his introduction that the exhibition was conceived as a mirror of the universal elements and emotions in the everydayness of life, as a mirror of the essential oneness of mankind throughout the world. And incidentally, just as an aside, I don't have time today to discuss this use of man for human in English, which is very common, or has been very common, which I know is not an issue in the German Mensch or in quite the same way. I simply highlight it here and note that it flags an enduring interdependence between anthropocentrism and androcentrism. But I'm just going to have to bracket that for today, alas. So the photographs depict a whole range of supposedly universal human activities and emotions from different countries: work, music making, literacy, grief, religion, justice, and so on. And the exhibition is, I think, a perfect illustration of the human we I've been talking about, emphasising as it does the essential oneness, as Steichen has it, of mankind, as he puts it. So Steichen's Family of Man is warmer and more generous-spirited, perhaps, than Epstein's, but I think there's the same basic conception at heart here, a clearly identified ahistorical, transcultural human community. Now, these are gorgeous photographs individually, and the problem comes, I think, when you put them together in the particular way that Steichen does, and they become problematic in a very particular way. So to give you a taste of these, I've got the first few series of images from the book. So we start off with wholesome heterosexual lovers from all different nations. We've got a series of these. I'll just take you through a few of them. As I say, I think they're lovely photographs in their own right. It's the way that Steichen puts them together that's potentially problematic. So we move from the wholesome heterosexual lovers, followed, of course, by the inevitability of marriage across nations and cultures. Followed, of course, by the inevitability of pregnancy. You'll note this is one of the very few non-human animals in the entire 503 photographs. And then, ultimately, to childbirth, and so on. There's a whole series of these clusters of photographs as you go through the book, a very fairly straightforward narrative, if you like. Okay, so Roland Barthes provided a critique of the Family of Man exhibition, or the Great Family of Man, as it was known by the time it reached Paris. And he describes how an ahistorical myth of human community is stressed by the exhibition, in which we are all supposedly members and in which we share. Barthes says, differences and exoticism are first emphasised, and then a magical unity emerges from the pluralism. Man is born, works, laughs and dies everywhere in the same way. Barthes calls this the ambiguous myth of the human community. The ambiguous myth of the human community, which serves as an alibi to a large part of our humanism. It exhibits an ideology of what Barthes calls classical humanism. Here, Barthes suggests, beneath the relativity of human institutions or the superficial diversity of human skin colour, one quickly reaches the solid rock of a universal human nature. History is suppressed, and a cultural mythological concept masquerades as natural. Barthes' particular objection to the exhibition's construction is that it ignores differences. This atomism, as he calls it, suppresses the specificities of inequality within and between particular human cultures and races. So in stressing what he called the essential oneness of mankind, Steichen's family of man provides a vision of a single, big, happy family. It's a vision of unified, universal human brotherhood, to use another very gendered term. This is a vision of one family, the single most important family, to which we all allegedly belong. This notion of one family is problematic for the reasons that Barth rightly points out. But Steichen's family of man also gives us a family of one in the following sense. His homogenizing vision of the essential oneness of mankind attempts to persuade us too, I think, of a family in which all the members are fundamentally the same, in which in fact there's just one single member, man with a capital M, an abstract, idealized, ahistorical, universal, classless, raceless, genderless individual. Now, Barth's critique urges us to appreciate differences within the great family of man, and in doing so, I think Barth ultimately leaves intact the unity of this greater family of man itself, this family of one. He argues, as he explicitly says, for a progressive humanism, which would restore history and difference, but ultimately to humanistic ends. And in what follows, I'm hoping to pursue a more radical critique of this great family of man, this family of one. I'm going to be looking for alternative unities and also for differences that cut across the boundary that supposedly separates the great family of man from other families of which some of us are a part. Now, I want to suggest that we might characterise the preeminent or exclusive self-identification as human, as a member of the great family of man, which we find in writers like Epstein and even Stockham, as a particular form of bad faith. It's a self-deception, a semi-acknowledged willful denial that an individual is more than this. For want of a better term, we might call it humanist bad faith. The waiter acts too much like a waiter, like an automaton or an object, aware that he's more than a waiter, but at the same time deceiving himself in this. And in the same way, I'm suggesting the humanist identifies preeminently or exclusively as human, denying that he or she is far more than this. Now, my concern with this humanist bad faith is not just that the writer or speaker is thinking inauthentically or self-deceptively, which is Sartre's primary concern in his elaboration of the notion of bad faith. More significant, I think, is the fact that this mode of address works to interpolate the reader or the listener. When Epstein or another writer, immersed in their individual project of humanist bad faith, addresses us with an inclusive, inviting human we, the text hails us, it calls to us, the readers, to recognise this human we as our own. In Altazer's elaboration of the notion of interpolation, a police officer calls out, "Hey you there," and those within earshot are moved to turn around, taking this call to be directed at them. And so it is in these texts, like Epstein's and even Stockham's and many others, that would call to us as human beings with a we. Steichen's exhibition does the same thing, I think, visually. The arrangement of the photographs, clearly identifying those universal human emotions and activities, invites us to recognise these emotions and activities as our own. As viewers of the exhibition, we're hailed as members of the family of man, the family of one. The effect of this humanist bad faith, this anthroponormative self-identification, this practice by writers and speakers of identifying exclusively as human by means of a we or an us, is that it hails the reader or listener as human too. Okay, so there are, of course, many other forms of self-identification, other we's with which we might claim allegiance, and I'll be suggesting 3 examples of these in the final part a little bit later. But in the next section, what I'd like to do is turn to Nietzsche to help us redress some of the problems with this particular form of interpolating humanist bad faith. And I want to make use of a particular idea or approach of Nietzsche's, which I think can provide a very productive means of addressing this question of self-identification. Can you all hear me okay? There's no mics. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no. I'm a bit quiet. Maybe I need to project more. Do shout out if you can't hear me, please. Okay, so this idea of Nietzsche's notion of becoming what you are, which I'm taking as my section heading for the second section, which he took originally from the ancient Greek poet Pindar, and made very much his own, he returned to it several times throughout his work. I'm going to focus in his later work in the autobiographical Ecce Homo, which is his most fully worked through approach to this notion of becoming what you are, and is in fact a subheading of the text as a whole. So wie man wird, was man ist, how one becomes what one is. It is in many ways, I'd argue, the key to understanding what Nietzsche is doing in this rather unconventional autobiography. So in Ecce Homo, written in 1888, at the very end, the absolute very end of his productive life, Nietzsche sets out to provide an account of how he became what he is. And there are two key elements to this account. In the early part of the book, he provides an account of his own character and disposition, concentrating particularly on his character traits and instincts and his practical choices in life. And these are the notorious sections with titles like Why I Am So Clever, Why I Am So Wise, Why I Write Such Great Books, and so on, which you may have come across. And there's certainly a great deal of grandiosity and posturing throughout Ecce Homo, no question about it. But in fact, large parts of these sections deal with very practical matters, such as making sure that you live in a place and climate that's right for you, that you're eating the right food that agrees with you, making the right choices in your recreational reading, and so on. They're about attending to your personal physiology and acting accordingly. And then in the bulk of the book, Nietzsche explains that he has become what he is, principally by means of writing his books. Most of Ecce Homo is comprised of short accounts of each of his works and how the themes and concerns with which they deal relate to particular periods of his life. So thus, Ecce Homo traces the development not just of Nietzsche's life or of his philosophy, but of the interconnection between the two. Now, Nietzsche explicitly explains what he means by the phrase become what you are in the 9th section of that part of the book titled Why I Am So Clever. And as so often with Nietzsche, this is a rich, sometimes cryptic discussion which makes many different points. But there are three core related points on which I'd like to focus, which I'd like to tease out, and which we can characterize under three imperatives that I'm going to work my way through. So Nietzsche's first imperative, there's Nietzsche. So his first imperative, to start with, Nietzsche says, do not seek to understand yourself too quickly. This will cause you to misunderstand, to belittle, to narrow yourself, to make yourself mediocre. And there are various aspects to this idea of his. Becoming what you are presupposes, in the first instance, that you have no idea what you are. You might make what seem like mistakes and take wrong turnings through your life, but you cannot know in advance that these will not, in the future, turn out to be valuable and even clever moves. Becoming what you are is not the same as the injunction to know yourself, know thyself. Attempting to do so leads, Nietzsche says, only to decline, self-forgetfulness, self-misunderstanding, and narrowing. Trying to know yourself too soon limits you. And then Nietzsche says, you should be wary of great words, attitudes, and imperatives. These too pose the threat that you will understand yourself, which is to say misunderstand yourself, too quickly. The key point then about not knowing yourself too soon is permitting yourself to become what you are, which is yet unknown. So that's the first imperative. Second imperative, Nietzsche says, don't suppress any of your different qualities and capacities. If you're going to allow yourself to become what you are, all your disparate qualities and capacities and faculties should not be allowed to disturb one another. All the different aspects of your character should be allowed to flourish, or at least be acknowledged. Contradictory qualities and virtues should be let be. Crucially, there must be no destroying or reconciling, he says. He suggests that we must practice the art of separating without antagonizing and permit a tremendous multiplicity, which is nonetheless the opposite of chaos. And then the third imperative, do not strive for anything or wish anything to be other than itself, or wish yourself to be other than you are. I have harboured no desire, Nietzsche says, and I have not sought honours, women, or money. Not that I could not have had them, he adds. This is not a resigned, quietist fatalism on Nietzsche's part, which would be absolutely un-Nietzschean, of course. Rather, the crux of his thinking here is anti-teleological. It's important, he's suggesting, not to set yourself goals. Rather, you should simply let things come to fruition. If you have the courage and singleness of purpose to allow your capacities and qualities and faculties to flourish, you will not need to set yourself external goals. Nietzsche himself, he says, just happened to find himself one day a philologist, and then at an unfeasibly early age a professor. Everything came easily without any struggling or striving, according to Nietzsche anyway. So he says, there's no ripple of longing as I look out over the calm sea of my immense future. Okay. So to summarise a little schematically, we can characterise Nietzsche's understanding of becoming what you are according to the three key terms that make up this phrase. First, he argues that you become what you are. I recounted his discussion according to three negative imperatives, three prohibitions even. And these perhaps emphasise the passive and prescriptive aspects to his thinking. And there is undoubtedly this aspect to his philosophy. But this is by no means all that Nietzsche is concerned with. Nietzsche is also all about actively embracing, enhancing, cultivating that which you are. In The Gay Science, when he addresses this issue, he says, we want to become who we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. And it's this very active process of writing his books, of course, that Nietzsche, through this process, that Nietzsche became what he was, he suggests. So Nietzsche is about cultivating and creating a self, but this self-creation is not about creation ex nihilo, it's about forging a self from what you have. You must be proactive about this, but you must also acknowledge what you're working with. So you should actively, creatively become what you are. Secondly, Nietzsche urges that you become what you are. The subtitle of Ecce Homo is Wie man wird, was man ist, how one becomes what one is. It's not der man ist, who one is. And there are at least two things that Nietzsche has in mind, I think, when he says that one must become what one is rather than who one is. I should, for honesty's sake, say that in other formulations he does sometimes say who one is, but I want to focus on the what as this principal formulation that he uses here at the end of his life. So there are two things that he has in mind, I think, when he says that one must become what one is rather than who one is. As I mentioned, Nietzsche is very keen in the early sections of Ecce Homo on accepting your own physiology and corporeality. We should be aware of the specific capacities and requirements of our physical bodies and work with these. So early in Why I Am So Clever, for instance, Nietzsche tells us how alcohol disagrees with him, although in his youth he says he could drink like a sailor, how he opposes eating vegetarian food, how a large meal is actually easier to digest than a small one, how he avoids snacks and coffee, preferring a little strong tea, and so on. He talks too of how climate speeds up or slows down the metabolism, how it's important to seek out places with dry air, Paris or Provence or Athens, for instance. Inappropriate diet or climate, Nietzsche suggests, will affect you profoundly, including your very thoughts and ideas. So secondly, Nietzsche's understanding here resonates with what he takes from Pindar. Pindar's understanding of becoming what you are is a non-internalist conception. He means to put into effect, to realise yourself through actions. There's no inner essence being fulfilled in Pindar's conception of becoming what you are. It's all about action and doing rather than navel-gazing. Similarly, Nietzsche has no interest in an internal personal essence, a deep who that we must learn about or find within ourselves. We must forge yourself from out of the materials we have. And we must not deny the past history of our actions and behaviour, the side paths and wrong turnings, the effort squandered on seemingly marginal tasks. The what is realised through your actions and behaviour. We might say then that we should act what rather than learn who we are, according to Nietzsche. So you should become, embody in action, what you are. And then finally, Nietzsche urges that you become what you are. There's an undeniable, unrelenting individualism to Nietzsche's approach. Nietzsche's advice or suggestions or imperatives here are all about becoming who or what you are. You must not know yourself too soon, must not reconcile your personal capacities, must not strive to be different from what you are. Rather, you must actively cultivate yourself and recognise your corporeal idiosyncrasies and actions. And in fact, this whole 9th section of Why I Am So Clever is elaborated as a means of addressing the importance of selfishness. Nietzsche will concede absolutely nothing to social or cultural context, and certainly nothing to ghastly Christian notions of selflessness. which he has plenty to say about. He is, in fact, absolutely opposed to any of the traditional political considerations of the sort with which I opened, of moderating or mediating between the individual and the collective. Of supreme, overriding importance is the cultivation of you, the one, the individual. So you should become the single individual one that you are. Okay, so we might question just how accurate Nietzsche's rather grandiose account of his own life and significance is. At this point, he was barely managing to publish his books. Grandiosity is the notion of the day here. And there's certainly a question mark over how much of his sanity, in fact, he retained at this point in his life. The book was completed just months before his famous mental collapse. And Nietzsche's approach to the question of becoming what you are is certainly not to everyone's taste. Personally, I like it as a sort of personal philosophy, perhaps, as a means of approaching or coping with life, but it's got this radical individualism that is perhaps not quite so attractive or helpful. So to return to my title, we might say that Nietzsche is concerned, to the extent that he's concerned with the family at all, with a family of one once again, but in a very different way from Steichen. There are references to Nietzsche's family, in fact, in Ecce Homo, to his father, his mother and his sister, most often disparaging. But the overriding impression you gain is of a single, absolutely self-contained individual, a family of one, if you like. But setting aside these questions, I want to put Nietzsche's notion of becoming what you are to work, to further a more expansive project than the individualism to which it immediately lends itself. I think we can use it to help us with the problem of humanist bad faith and with the problem of interpolative, anthroponormative self-identification that I was outlining. In other words, I think we can use it to stop us striving to be other than we are, to stop us suppressing our different capacities, and to stop us attempting to know ourselves too quickly. Nietzsche's starting point is a family of one, but it's a very different family of one from Steichen's. We've moved entirely away from Steichen's ahistorical, universal man, that abstract figure that represents the oneness of mankind. Nietzsche's one, the one that each of us must individually strive to become, is always a particular individual, and it's not even a coherent, consistent individual, as he emphasised, with his talk of preserving all those disparate capacities and qualities. In an interview from the 1970s, when asked about his use of Nietzsche's work, Foucault said, and this should say the attribution should be to Foucault rather than Nietzsche. For myself, I prefer to utilise the writers I like. The only valid tribute to thought such as Nietzsche's is precisely to use it, to deform it, to make it groan and protest. And so, taking my cue from Foucault, I'm going to be putting Nietzsche's thought to work. And I want to take up two of the component parts of his approach, the becoming and the what, and to subvert the last, to subvert that singular you. I'm going to take Nietzsche at his word with regard to becoming, which is to say with regard to forging a self or identity from what you have, and I'm going to take him at his word with regard to the what, which is to say with regard to the importance of corporeality and physiology and action. But with regard to the you, I fear I'm going to be making Nietzsche groan and protest. It's my hope that I can make this you into a we, or better, into lots of different we's. And so I'd like in the final section to outline far too briefly 3 alternative other than human collectives, or if you'll permit me, other than human families to which we belong. Okay, so I want to think about other forms of self-identification as alternatives to the humanist bad faith that I outlined at the start. And I'm going to outline 3 tentative examples of alternative collectives or collectivities under the headings lineages, colours and cunnilingus, which in fact cross over species boundaries altogether. I'm not suggesting for a moment that these exhaust the possibilities of alternative non-human collectivities. There are many, many other such collectivities I might have chosen to discuss this afternoon, but these each struck me as important or interesting or a good starting point. So, as a first alternative to the great family of man, I want to consider alternative familial collectivities. Most of us, of course, consider ourselves as belonging to familial collectivities that are considerably less extensive than the huge family of man that Steichen was discussing or illustrating. I can think of myself as constituting a we with my immediate family, nuclear or single parent, my extended family, however we might conceive that, and so on. But I'd like to think now, for my first examples of non-human collectivities to which we each belong, about broader or wider or larger familial collectivities that go beyond the human we. Orson Welles and Hunter S. Thompson both articulate an oft-heard, rather pessimistic characterization of life. Wells says, "We're born alone, we live alone, we die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we're not alone." And Hunter S. Thompson, similarly, "We're all alone, born alone, die alone, and in spite of true romance magazines, we shall all someday look back on our lives and see that, in spite of our company, we were alone the whole way." Both quotations capture again that notion of the family of one in the Nietzschean sense, I think. I don't know about living and dying alone, but one of the very few constants regarding individual creatures' birth or creation is that they are precisely not born alone. Every living thing had parents, or more properly, every living thing sprang from parental genetics information. In familial terms, the first necessary we is that constituted by an individual and its parent or parents. This is true irrespective of the mechanism of reproduction and applies even to bacteria who reproduce by cellular division. After this most basic of familial we's, the parent-offspring we can extend the familial collectivity by adding siblings, further progeny, some grandparents, and so on, as we prefer, as we want to construct the family tree. Now, we appreciate that the family trees of this thought that we construct represent actual individuals, me, my daughter, my partner, my parents, and so on. And then we tend to think of evolutionary phylogenetic trees on the same model. We imagine the component species as distinct entities descending one from another. This illustration that you can see on each of the slides is from Haeckel's The Evolution of Man from 1874. And notice how the tree culminates at its peak with this capitalized man. We need not think of an evolutionary tree, a tree of life, as modelled on family trees, though. In principle, these two are one and the same. Given a large enough piece of paper, you could, in principle, extend your family tree backwards, and it would eventually become an evolutionary tree. Your immediate ancestors are human, of course, but as you go further back, this isn't the case. But as we go further back through the generations, it becomes more convenient to divide up this lineage, not in terms of an increasingly inclusive family, but in terms of taxonomic ranks. Instead of pausing at the level of grandparents, for instance, we can pause at the level of species and think, as we saw earlier, of a we that comprises the whole of humanity, the great family of man. Or we could pause further back at the level of genus, such that the individual on whom you pause is an ancestor of the many species of Homo, not just Homo sapiens, but Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, and so on. At the taxonomic rank of genus, then, we can say we humans. And it's an interesting question as to whether those other species of human be included or not in the great family of man. Or going further back still, we reach the order of primates, the class of mammals, the kingdom of animals, and so on, for all the many taxonomic ranks. We each belong to all these many familial we's. Note, though, that these ranks are an historical taxonomic convention. They're fantastically useful, to be sure, but the traditional 8 major ranks are a somewhat arbitrary convention. In principle, we could stop off at any point on that unbroken lineage. Following your family line back, pausing at particular individuals, there are no clearly demarcated ranks that reflect clear divisions in the lineage. Rather, there's just a generation after generation of parent-child relationships, with each child differing slightly from the parent. Diachronically, there are no sharp breaks between individuals, and it's not possible to identify the exact point at which, following the lineage back, we move from, for example, the order of primates into the broader class of mammals. Nietzsche warns us not to know ourselves too soon, not to identify ourselves with great words and attitudes and imperatives, such as, I would suggest, the myth of the great family of man. In addition to this family of man, we each belong to many familial collectivities. We can choose to claim allegiances, to isolate we's according to various more or less arbitrary points along our unbroken lineage. Each such family will be not a family of one in the sense implicit in Sykon's notion, the family of man, where the oneness of mankind manifests in the universal man. Rather, these many families, plural, of which we are a part, will be comprised, as Nietzsche would have it, of particular individuals, each of whom differs always from their fellows. Okay, so that's my first example of ways of thinking about alternative collectivities, alternative families. I'd like now to think a little bit about perceptual collectivities. Humans are traditionally thought to possess the familiar five senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell and touch. There are other faculties that are usually classified as senses in the scientific literature, however: thermoception, the sense of heat; proprioception, the sense of the relative positions of your body parts; nociception, sensitivity to pain, and so on. It's ambiguous as to how many different senses we want to classify. So I think we could certainly conceive collectivities based on particular perceptual capacities which cross species: we who see, we who hear, we who are sensitive to pain, and so on. But we should immediately complicate the notion of perceptual collectivities by starting not from the species, but with Nietzsche, from the particular individual. We should remember, that is, that not every member of a given species, including humans, will possess all the senses possessed by other members of that species. Not all humans can see or hear or experience pain, of course. And further, there are some human individuals who possess additional senses. Some humans, as you may know, have developed a form of echolocation for getting around, for instance. So any collectivity that we conceive based on perceptual faculties will certainly cross species, and it will do so unevenly, depending on the individuals in question. Even so, characterising collectivities in terms of having a sense or not is still a rather crude characterisation. Of course, there are significant differences in terms of the power or range or extent of an individual's or a species' different perceptions. So I'd like to complicate things a little further still in terms of these perceptual collectivities. And I'd like to focus on sight, and in particular on colour vision. Humans as a whole have very poor vision in some regards, for instance in terms of range or night vision, but very impressive vision in others, colour discrimination. Human retinas have three kinds of cone cell, the photoreceptors which are sensitive to colour, each of which is sensitive to a different wavelength of light. Humans, along with many other primates and some other mammals, are thus trichromats. Combining the sensitivity of the different wavelengths of these three different kinds of cone permits trichromats to perceive a massive range of colours. Dichromats, such as dogs and most other mammals who have two kinds of cone cell, see far fewer colours. So just to illustrate that a little, on the left you've got images as humans see them, and on the right as dogs see them, broadly speaking. And notice how the dogs can distinguish yellows and greens and blues, but they can't distinguish red at all. A dog will find it difficult to spot a bright red ball in the middle of a green lawn that would stand out very, very distinctly to a human eye. And of course, they'd be able to sniff it out because they've got a fantastically sensitive smell, but they wouldn't be able to see it in anything like as clear a way as humans. On the other hand, many birds and insects can detect additional wavelengths of light. Birds have four kinds of cone. They're tetrachromats and can perceive ultraviolet wavelengths that are undetectable to humans. So comparing these two photographs of these flowers, these black-eyed Susans, the image on the right has been taken with a camera able to detect ultraviolet light and reveals patterns otherwise undetectable to humans that would stand out automatically to most species of bird. So we could conceive a perceptual collectivity based not on sight per se, but on colour vision, which would distinguish us trichromats, humans and howler monkeys, from dichromats, dogs and donkeys, and tetrachromats, turkeys and terns. We could complicate and multiply these collectivities still further, though. Rather than saying we trichromats, we might say we who distinguish particular colours. Thus, most humans would constitute a we with dogs if we were interested in the capacity to distinguish blue from green, but not if we're interested in the capacity to distinguish red from green. And I say most humans because, of course, individual humans and individual dogs, for that matter, vary. So-called colour blindness, as you may know, means that 8% of men and about 0.5% of women are unable to distinguish some combination of colours and will thus share in slightly different we's in this regard. There's even the possibility, as yet unverified, that certain human individuals are actually tetrachromats, who might thus share in collectivities with different species again. Finally, we should remember that for each of us, our colour vision has changed. Although babies are not monochromats, as is sometimes suggested, unable to distinguish colour at all, that is, their ability to distinguish colour becomes more refined as they get older. For each of us, our colour vision has changed over time, and with it, the we's with which we might align ourselves. So to summarise, we can conceive a different scale or different scales of perceptual collectivity depending on how much colour we're interested in. We can say we trichromats as opposed to dichromats or tetrachromats, and this collectivity already crosses species boundaries. But we can also say we who can distinguish different pairs of colours, for instance green and blue, which would include some dichromats within our collectivity. And when we consider any of these perceptual collectivities, we must remember that some human individuals will be included and some excluded. And also that any given individual will be part of such a perceptual collectivity at one time, but perhaps not at another, as the changing colour perception of human infants demonstrates. Nietzsche's own vision deteriorated significantly, and his eyes gave him terrible trouble in the last years of his life. The perceptual collectivities of which he was a part, changed, as they do for all of us who are attentive to becoming what we are. Okay, so I've looked at the question of familial collectivities and then at the question of perceptual collectivities. For my third and final example, I want to think about behavioural collectivities. You'll remember the gallery of pictures I showed at the start from Steichen's Family of Man exhibition. We saw people engaging in a variety of supposedly universal human activities: heterosexual lovers cavorting, marriage, the rituals of pregnancy and childbirth, and so on. I've deliberately chosen this last collectivity to counteract the very heteronormative connotations of that picture series, and perhaps also with the focus on reproduction and lineage in my first alternative, familial collectivities. There are, of course, many forms of behaviour in which humans and members of other species engage. I'd like to focus on sex, only implied by Steichen, of course, and in particular I want to focus on oral sex. Members of many, many different species practice oral sex. You might have seen documentaries about sex-obsessed bonobo chimpanzees, but oral sex is also enjoyed by deer, whales, walruses, sheep, lions, cheetahs, bears, hyenas, kangaroos, bats, and many more. For the sake of brevity, I want to focus on cunnilingus, and I want to look briefly at two species who engage in this form of oral sex. These two examples on the illustrations come from Bruce Bagomill's fascinating book, Biological Exuberance, which looks at 300 or so species who engage in what he calls homosexual, bisexual, or non-reproductive or alternative heterosexual behaviours. So, my first example, these are long-eared hedgehogs. They engage in varied affectionate and sexual practices, including rubbing, cuddling and sliding, which you can see at the top here. Both heterosexual and lesbian pairs engage in cunnilingus. You can see two females at the bottom here, involving extensive licking, sniffing and nibbling of each other's genitals. And my other example, much as I hate to leave the hedgehogs, are the bottlenose and spinner dolphins, who engage in a very wide variety of sexual activities: heterosexual, bisexual and homosexual. This certainly includes a great deal of clitoral stimulation by means of snout, flippers and even tails. And in fact, because both males and females have a genital slit, both can be penetrated with a beak and stimulated genitally. We might quibble as to whether this strictly counts as cunnilingus when performed on a male dolphin, but the activity is the same when performed on or by both males and females. And there are two particular forms of cunnilingus, broadly conceived, that I wanted to mention. I mentioned earlier that some humans have developed a form of echolocation to get around, but dolphins are of course some of nature's experts at this. And one of the forms of cunnilingus in which they engage is genital buzz. I don't know if you've come across this before. It's a sort of form of acoustic foreplay. One partner stimulates the other by directing a stream of low-pitched, rapid buzzing clicks at the genital area of their partner. And the other form of dolphin cunnilingus is genital beak propulsion, which you can see here, in which one partner inserts their beak into the partner's genitals and then gently propels them both forward. So that's my final slide, just to reassure you. So we can think of collectivities based on sexual behaviour, in this case, we who engage in oral sex or we who engage in cunnilingus. And once again, this collectivity crosses species boundaries. And I want to point out two things that the behaviour makes possible I want to point out that the behaviour that makes possible this particular collectivity is, of course, individual and intermittent. Not every individual, whether they're human or hedgehog or a dolphin, engages in cunnilingus. And of course, even those who do, thank goodness, don't do it all the time. As with the examples of perceptual collectivities based on colour discrimination, it's important to start with the individual, and we should not talk in terms here of entire species. It doesn't make sense to suggest that humans or hedgehogs or dolphins engage in cunnilingus. Some individuals do this and are part of this collectivity sometimes. It's important when considering behavioural collectivities, at least if we're to benefit from a Nietzschean perspective, to start not at the level of the species, conceived in rather generalised atemporal terms, but at the level of, once again, particular individuals here and now. So these have been my three tentative alternative ways of thinking about collectivities. I've focused on familial collectivities by looking not at the great family of man, but at other taxonomic ranks or lineages to which we belong. I've looked at perceptual collectivities, specifically those we might construct based on the facility we share to discriminate colour. And I've looked at behavioural collectivity, specifically the sporadic individual activity of engaging in oral sex. There are, of course, many, many more kinds of collectivity, many more we's of which we might consider ourselves a part. I started with one of the traditional conceptions of politics, which suggests that it's a negotiation or mediation between the individual and the collective. And I suggested the notion of the family of one can be used to help us to think about this a little, in particular about the question of identity, which is fundamental to that of politics. We looked at Steichen, who provides us with a family of one, which focuses particularly on the collective, the enduring universal family of man. And we looked at Nietzsche, who provides us with a very different family of one, which focuses instead on the particular individual. Thus, though they're not explicitly political commentators, we could imagine these two, Steichen and Nietzsche, as implicitly representing extreme positions on the spectrum of ways of mediating between the individual and the collective. But there's another conception of politics, as elaborated by Foucault, for instance, which understands it to be a matter of endlessly fluctuating power relations. In the tussles and turns of these asymmetric power relations, knowledge is a stake or tool or even a weapon that's deployed, appropriated and contested by the participants in the relationship. Knowledge is not for understanding, Foucault said, it's made for cutting. And so in addressing the question of political zoology today, I'd like to consider my alternative collectivities, the many potential familial collectivities, the many potential perceptual collectivities, the many potential behavioural collectivities, not so much as ways of thinking about how a self-evident individual fits into a clearly defined collective. Rather, I'd prefer to think of them as a series of necessarily unfinished interventions into the question of the very nature of the individual and of the collective. I'm anxious that we reject the single self-evident family of one, the family of man, with which Steichen starts. And I'm anxious too, much as I love him, to reject the single self-contained family of one, the lone individual, at which Nietzsche stops. What I'd like to suggest is that if we start with Nietzsche from the particular individual in all its diversity and contradictory variety, it's possible to acknowledge many very different collectivities, different families even, that go far beyond a single uniform family of man. This, I'd like to suggest, would be the beginning of a true political zoology. Thank you.